And now we have Tomke and Susan presenting their work. Suzanne, sorry.
No problem. Tomke's presenting for us both, for everyone. So awesome. Thanks, Tomke.
All right, thank you. I'll try to share my slides. All right, yeah, welcome to our presentation. Suzanne and my presentation about leadership practices in a very specific context. That's the entrepreneurial ecosystem. I refer to it as EE from now on, it's just quicker. And we present the notion of illusionary ecosystem leadership to explore how business incubators and accelerators reproduce inequalities in entrepreneurship. And I would like to start by acknowledging that the University of Manitoba campuses are located on the original lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. And I myself am located on the traditional territories of the Kwantlen, Katzie, and Stolo nations, which is also known as the Greater Vancouver Area in British Columbia. So our theme is rebooting with equalities, and we look at equalities in the EE, which is marked by systemic inequalities toward women and diverse entrepreneurs. Entrepreneurial ecosystems can be defined as a set of interconnected processes and actors, individuals, organizations, and institutions that connect, mediate, and govern the entrepreneurial environment. The EE is an interesting context to study leadership with the specific goal of equality and inclusion in mind, because it's a complex system with multiple actors on multiple levels, but without any formal leaders. And we conceptualize leadership here as a form of complexity and emergent leadership. We view it as a practice where actors, not necessarily individuals, form into a system of action, and where leaders create condition and influence others to catalyze mechanisms, while not necessarily being in a formal leadership position. And that involves creating a sense of direction, orientation, and action space, for example. Our study is a discourse study, and since context is super important with discourse studies, we'd like to give a brief insight into the context, and that's the Canadian EE. So entrepreneurship is in Canada is among the highest worldwide, but only 15.6% of entrepreneurs are women. They're more likely to be in the service industry than in tech. And their businesses have about 68,000 Canadian dollars less revenue than men with similar businesses, and they're less likely to achieve scale-up status. And from an intersectional perspective, Indigenous women entrepreneurs, just as an example, are motivated more by community benefits and social impact than any financial value. At the same time, government policies, programs, and initiatives focus on technology-enabled and high-growth innovations. Here's a screenshot of the programs under the Skills and Innovation Plan that was initiated in 2017, and that's the overarching federal system behind the development and support of entrepreneurship. They right away announced that they will focus on highly innovative industries such as clean technology, advanced manufacturing, digital technology, and so on. And you can see in this grid, as much as you can see it like with a small screen, that most of the programs touch on technology and the digital economy. That's not to say that these can't help strengthen other sectors, but a lot of money and the discourse's emphasis is put on specific types of enterprises, that is technology-enabled high-growth ventures. And if we combine that with the information from the previous slide, that doesn't address women entrepreneurs so much. Canada has, however, added a women entrepreneurship strategy 2 years later in 2019, and some of the programs have started to have streams for underrepresented groups. So we can see that there's a strong focus on technology-driven innovation here, and at the same time, the initiatives for inclusive innovation are growing. So in our study, we look at business incubators and accelerators. I'll refer to them as BIAs from now on. They're organizations that provide services to young entrepreneurial firms, and they're often, not always, non-profit organizations that are funded through federal or provincial economic initiatives, and also funds from private corporations. And in the literature, they've been found to be central actors and intermediaries because they connect entrepreneurs to resources, including investors, grants, business networks, and so on, and also vice versa. And they are also seen as gatekeepers in the EE because they choose the entrepreneurs that will get the connection to the resources and so on. And they also choose what the resources are exactly, including training, mentorship, and support. And that's why we argue that BIAs collectively in the EE have the capacity to tackle inequalities because they can collectively engage in complexity leadership by creating conditions within the EE. So included in the studies is data from websites of 90 Canadian BIAs. We found those through 3 large national networks and then kind of snowballed to other networks that we found on those websites. And the goal was to have a representative sample of Canadian BIAs. We included those that are open to the public, and that excluded university incubators that provide services only to students and faculty, just because their mandate differs a little bit from public BIAs. And we collected 2 types of data. The main source are textual excerpts from the home pages about Ask sections, any program-specific pages on the websites. And the second set is a visual analysis of staff, board, directors, and mentors in terms of their diversity. But this analysis is still ongoing, so we don't have any specific statistics yet in this presentation. And as mentioned, we used critical discourse analysis, both as a methodological and also as a conceptual approach to analyze the textual excerpts. And in analyzing these texts, we looked at the language, how they presented themselves, how they presented their program, and also any specialized programs that they have for women or diverse entrepreneurs, including newcomer entrepreneurs, indigenous entrepreneurs, entrepreneurs with disabilities, and so on. And if and how they practice leadership around social change issues. And that led us to 3 overarching discourse themes. And in those themes, we looked at the interactional level. So we looked at whom do they speak to, like whom do they address, and how. And that showed us that they speak to these 2 sets of stakeholders that were earlier on the figure. Once the entrepreneurs, and then also their external partners. That's public and private funders, investors, business networks, the governments, the municipalities, and so on. And so we had per theme, we came to 2 discursive practices for each of these sets of stakeholders. And we'll now present these discursive practices and then a model that we've developed from them. So the first set of discursive practices are imposing normative boundaries and maintaining structures. And we came to these when we looked at the first discourse theme, and that's also the most prevalent one. That is that the business characteristics of the ventures BIAs are looking to support are a high growth, scalable, and often also global venture that will have a financial impact on the region wherever they're located. You can see 2 exemplary quotes from the websites here. And so in addressing the entrepreneurs, the discursive practice is about imposing normative boundaries. So in the language of leadership, BIAs provide an orientation and set conditions for the entrepreneurs and their ventures in setting requirements of how their ventures should look like. And this focus on high growth global ventures already shows a gendered notion within entrepreneurship that targets businesses from stereotypically male-dominated disciplines such as science and technology. At the same time, we pair this with the second discursive practice, maintaining structures. So by imposing these boundaries, BIAs also, in fact, reassure their external partners that they will follow their notion of the successful entrepreneurial venture. So that is one of high growth and high revenue with an impact on the region and so on. Especially this reference always to the impact on the region is much more targeted to the external partners than the entrepreneurs, because BIAs are reassuring them that they will take care of it, and in that sense they're practicing leadership. And ultimately those practices will uphold the current systems, and with that also the systemic inequalities. The second set of discursive practices is one new one defining social and human capital, and then the other one is a repetition of the previous one, maintaining structures. And these come from the discourse theme that BIAs will provide entrepreneurs with access to a community and a network, and they'll help them to learn the skills and knowledge that they'll need to succeed. So we refer to the community and network as social capital, and then to the skills and knowledge as human capital. So we name this defining social and human capital because in leadership speak, this is again an orientation or a sense of direction for entrepreneurs to have an idea what they will need to succeed and where they'll get it at the BIAs. But then at the same time, BIAs also decide what it is that they need and who will receive the support. So their idea of social and human capital that is needed is aligned with the business characteristics that I mentioned earlier. So one of high growth and high revenue ventures. And then paired with a visual analysis of the staff and board of directors and mentors that already shows that the community and those who also teach the skills and knowledge is a very homogeneous group. It's very white and male dominated. And we know from like homophily principles, similarity, attraction, etc., that people tend to choose and support others that are similar to them. And they will also bring their own worldview and lived experience. So there's the probability that they'll reproduce this homogeneity. Similar to before, with this theme, BIAs are also addressing the other set of stakeholders, the external partners. They're again kind of like reassuring them that they will deliver the entrepreneurs that fit their notion of a successful entrepreneur. The external stakeholders are kind of like meant to believe that BIAs can handle the selection and the training of the entrepreneurs that will bring this economic prosperity to the region. So ultimately, they are again discursively maintaining the structures, and this again upholds the current systems. Our last set of discursive practices stands in contrast to the previous ones. They're basically what we would call a crack or a fissure in the discourse. They come from the third and the last theme that we found, that BIAs call for businesses that are sustainable and resilient. And they often also include language around like justice and inclusion. And they are calling for entrepreneurs that are change makers. We call this shifting cultural cognitive systems as a discursive practice because that now moves away from the overall discourse, away from high growth and high revenue new business. So they're now valuing diverse thinking for change, which means that the target group of entrepreneurs will be different from before. With this shift, they're disturbing structures as a second discursive practice, as opposed to maintaining them. So in addressing their external stakeholders, they're challenging their standard beliefs and values of the successful entrepreneurial venture and the successful entrepreneur. And interestingly, this goes much more to the original definition of entrepreneurship, which doesn't target specific industries or measures it by growth or financial impact. And we argue that this is where the change can happen, where current systems can be transformed. And then we put that all together into a model. I'm hoping you can see it properly on the screen, that shows the impact of BIA's discursive practices on equity, diversity, and inclusion in entrepreneurial ecosystems. And we draw on institutional theory to explain these power differences, power conflicts between the different institutional forces. As we've shown earlier at the government policies and initiatives, there is a power struggle already in the regulatory and normative institutions. On one hand, the programs and policies, so the regulatory institutional forces, clearly target high technology entrepreneurship and ventures with high revenue, and that's built on systemic inequalities. But recently, they also call for more inclusive innovation. So this already creates and this creates the normative institutional forces, so also the norms and the standards, what's expected of entrepreneurship. And now BIA's discursive practices kind of reflect that. The overarching discourse is clearly one of high growth global ventures with high revenue, and that'll maintain the current structures in the system. You can see this here on the three upper white boxes in the model. And the cracks in the discourse come from shifting the cultural cognitive institutional forces, so moving away from valuing high growth businesses to valuing more resilient and sustainable ones. And we label these discursive practices illusionary leadership, and this illusionary leadership happens on two levels. So first, as shown in this upper part with the three white boxes, it's illusionary because BIAs in their discourse position themselves as leaders, but in fact they confirm and maintain the institutional forces, so they're more led by them. Because they are addressing multiple stakeholders, their clients, and then essentially, to a big part, their funders, they are caught in a power struggle to cater to all of them. By imposing normative boundaries and defining social and human capital, they position themselves as leaders toward the entrepreneurs, but then they also have to attest their external partners' goals and regulations. So discursively, they maintain their structures. And that in turn upholds systemic inequalities on which those structures are built and the institutional force is created. And the second level of illusionary leadership is in the overall discursive practices, so all five of these white boxes. The lower part of the model shows the cracks in the discourse. So shifting the notion of the successful business disturbs these structures. So a shift in cultural cognitive systems is where the change can happen, but currently the discourse is clearly more at the upper part of the model, and that makes the discursive practices altogether, again, illusionary leadership when it comes to BIA's leadership in transforming systemic inequalities. I'm almost done. So overall, currently BIAs take on this illusionary leadership role, and the systemic inequalities are being upheld, but we argue that change can happen when shifting the cultural cognitive institutional pressures. So we're very interested in hearing your thoughts and feedback. It is the first time that we're presenting this study anywhere. And we're planning to do a case study, to follow this study with a case study, where we're going to select a handful of business incubators and accelerators to go into much more in-depth of their practices at the sites. Yeah, and we're interested in hearing your thoughts about a few of our questions here. Thanks.
Okay, thanks very much. Let's open it up for questions from anyone.
You use the term BIAs. I'm not really familiar with the term, but my knowledge of incubators and accelerators, the accelerators tend to focus more on the high growth and high revenue, and incubators can be at least from my experience, tend to be more across the spectrum in terms of scale and scope and size and that kind of thing. Yeah. How did you define those independently, or did you define those collectively, or were there any kind of any differences between those two?
That's a good question. Thank you. So when we started out with the study, we actually wanted to focus on incubators, but the definitions are just all over the place. Like there are definitions for both incubators and accelerators, and as we've said, like incubators is more at the ideation stage, so early on, not necessarily across the board, but like early ideation stage, whereas accelerators are like a little later, more to like grow and scale businesses. But in reality, organizations use them all over the place. Like some call themselves an accelerator, but then are really more like an incubator at the very early stages. Some don't actually use those terms at all, but clearly offer those services to entrepreneurs at early stages. So in the end, we could see as well at at those business networks that we use to collect our data, that usually they are then used in one term, like business incubators and accelerators, and then they're all lumped together. Or sometimes also they're referred to as entrepreneurial business support organizations. That's why we chose to take them both, because in the end it doesn't make a difference in the real field.
Okay, thank you.
Welcome.
Okay, can you still hear me?
Yeah.
I've lost all video. I have no idea what's happening.
We've lost yours too.
Can you see me if I do? Do I look fine to you? Is it just me?
Now you're back.
Well,
Yeah.
I can't see you, but you can see me, so that's fine. We have a question from Julia now.
Hello, it was just to say how closely that's related to my experience in, for instance, on the sustainable business side. I'm working with in a voluntary capacity for a university library in Bangladesh, and their aim is to work with the community, for the community, to enable the students to grow. Their aim isn't to create funding, the business sustains itself. So that's very much in line with my experience externally. And last night I was speaking to a group in Ohio where the statistics they showed were very much related to, in the same way you were saying, women are less likely to be in STEM, that in that space, white people were 3 times more likely to be employed within a STEM environment than black people with the same level of qualifications. And it just, so much of what you're saying, seems to align with what I've learned about enterprise or entrepreneurship schemes, that they're very much at universities, they're aimed at the higher level students. They're aimed without intention towards students in the traditionally more white study groups. And I'm saying this not as an academic, I'm not an academic, just so that we're clear, I'm not from that space. But just to say, I think what your study seemed to be exactly what a reflection of exactly what I see.
Thanks, Julia. It's also right. Thanks. There is a bunch of literature on how entrepreneurial ecosystems are gendered and exclusionary to underrepresented groups. And another reason why we therefore wanted to look at incubators and accelerators is because they are at the early stages. They support entrepreneurs very early on when they're entering this space, basically. So we were wondering a little bit, like, what do they do in this regard? Like, are they really also like gatekeepers in bringing on the same people all the time, or do they have the capacity, and we think they should, and do they actually bring on, like, do they support like a more of an inflow of diverse entrepreneurs into the system? So it'll be interesting to see a bit more when we're on site, right? But that was the literature behind that, was like what you said, Julia, with your experience. One reason why we looked at incubators and accelerators.
Suzanne, do you want to comment or add to that?
Thank you, Nicole. Yes, I'm not asking my own co-author a question. Since I didn't see other hands, I thought I'd take the opportunity to ask if anyone would like to comment on how we're using leadership in this study, or whether the kind of leadership focus stands up. Clearly it's around discursive practices and Tomke mentioned leadership language. And so I just wondered if anyone had comments on that could be helpful to us as we carry it forward. If not, that's all fine too. Thank you.
I'll give everyone just a second more to think about your question. Well, maybe, do you two want to expand on that? Sorry, I have dogs. Do you two want to expand on a little bit for us about how you see leadership playing in this? Or why you chose to go down the road of leadership?
Yeah, so when we initially collected this website data, we didn't plan on focusing on leadership, but it was much more inductive that we saw, well, they're really using language of we're the ones who take care of everything in the system. So that's why we looked more into leadership in that sense, and we came to complexity leadership because it is so aligned with that, like the whole complex system of an entrepreneurial ecosystem and so on. So in that sense, yeah, it's interesting to hear from the audience here if it's convincing or not. Yeah. If anyone has some thoughts.
Or on anything else, obviously.
Yeah.
Thanks, Tomke. Well stated.
Well, I do have a question that is not exactly about the leadership thing. I'm sorry if
That's
I'm
okay.
I just wanted to know more about, I don't know which one it was. I think it was the third theme, maybe the thinking for change. And you were talking about how people were realizing that diversity was good because it added, good viewpoints and things like that. How did you see that? Or maybe you didn't, but is that different than sort of the business case for diversity? The idea of thinking that diversity is only good for profitability, or did it go beyond that into valuing diversity for diversity's sake?
That's a really good question. I guess I would have to look a little closer at the data, but I think I guess both. Now that I think about it, because you can see a little bit of that in separate streams of, we have a women's incubator, or we have an incubator for immigrant entrepreneurs or something like that, which kind of probably goes more not so much to the business case, but more to we're supporting you because you're part of our society. But then also we could see that many, and that's why it's more like a crack in the discourse, that many use the language they have in their, just an example, in their value statements, they have as number one, we're inclusive, but then you don't see any action on the websites, nothing that really picks up on supporting diverse entrepreneurs or supporting resilient businesses or change maker thinking or something. So I guess it's a little bit of both. So it's a good question to look a bit more at that. Thanks.
Yeah. Well, just as you're thinking about what maintains structures, what shifts structures, it'd be maybe to differentiate in those two, maybe not. But we have two more questions in a few more minutes. So Shubhashni, and I'm sorry if I said that wrong, but you want to ask your question? If you're, Shubhashni, do you want to ask? Can anyone hear them? Is that not?
No.
Okay. Well, if your mic works in the next few minutes, you're welcome to chime in. No, we can't hear you. You're welcome to type it in the chat. In the Meantime, though, Stephen, do you want to ask a quick question while we wait for Shubhashini to?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask a quick question about you had the two I guess the two paradigms, the current one that you define as the high growth, high revenue, impact on region. I guess I would ask like how you define impact on region, and I wonder if like what you're talking about, the change to increase diversity and resilience and sustainability, if that couldn't be more additive into the impact on region as opposed to a break or a paradigm shift from those. And I guess I'm just curious what your thoughts on that were.
That's a good question. Thanks. So the this impact on the region, it really comes from the data. So a lot of the BIAs in their purpose statement or like whatever in their About Us section or something say that they're growing the entrepreneurs so that the region wherever they're in is going to benefit from them. It is a lot like it's often stated as like an economic benefit for the region or economic impact on the region, something like that. And we, like as we've said, like we argue that this is more to speak to the external stakeholders and being like, yep, we hear you. You want entrepreneurship as an economic development mechanism. When it comes to the, as you've called it now, the new paradigm, or like the other, third theme that moves away from this high growth, etc. Some of them speak more in the language of like, we want to see an impact on the planet and the people, which is a little more, a bit more bigger, I guess, than just the region. But others, like you sometimes also see that in saying that they want to have an impact on the community, or like a social impact or cultural impact or something like that. And I think, like in terms of your question, it could be seen as additive to the financial impact on the region for sure. Right now, I'm not sure if I would see that in the data.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks for the question.
We're at time. I'm sorry, Shubhashini, that we didn't get a chance to hear your question. But I just want to say thank you to all of our presenters. These were great presentations, and thank you to the participants for your good questions as well. All right. So
thank you, Nicole.
Yep.
Thank you.
On to the online.
Yeah, thanks for hosting.
Thank you.
Great job.
Thank you.
Thanks.